we'll make a start. So, my name's Akashamitra, and as Kusala Sara said in the first half, what we're going to be doing in the second half is carrying on with our series of talks on Milarepa. It was interesting hearing, just before I start, it was interesting hearing Surya Gupta talk just now, because it reminded me of my grandmother. So she lived to be 100 years old, and I asked her the same question that Surya Gupta asked, because you always do, when somebody's really that old, you want to know what keeps them going, don't you? So I remember my gran died over Christmas, but she was 100 years old when she died. And I remember asking her, what's your secret? How have you lived so long? And she said, well, son, I'll tell you what it is. It's vodka. So slightly different from... she said, every Saturday night I have a little vodka and a packet of crisps. I'm sure it was much more than that. But I remember on her 99th birthday, I asked her what she wanted for her birthday. She said, just get us a bottle of vodka, son. And I said, Nan, I can't do that. It's your 99th birthday. And she said, well, not just any bottle. You know, the one with the little gold bits in it. So anyway, that was my gran. But, yeah. So what we're going to do is carry on talking about Milarepa this evening. And so I'll say a little bit about him, but actually what we're concerned with this evening is his meeting with a very, very significant person. So he had a meeting with somebody who would be very significant for him, and Milarepa would change the course of this person's life. So Milarepa was a Tibetan yogi, so he was a Tibetan Dharma practitioner, and he's somebody that spent most of his life in retreat. So he spent most of his life in a secluded retreat, in caves, in the snow, in the Himalayas. And so he was a very, very interesting character. And one of the things that's worth noting about Milarepa is that when he came to the Buddhist path, he had a very, very sort of weighty past behind him. So he'd done some very, very negative things in his life. He'd been responsible for the death of many, many, many people through black magic. He was a black magician before he came to the Buddhist path. And that's part of what motivated him to practice so sincerely and so wholeheartedly, was that he came with a lot of unskillful deeds to undo. And maybe I'll say a little bit more about that later. But the thing that I want to talk about this evening, as I said, is his meeting with a particular young man. And Milarepa was out one day near his cave where he'd been meditating. So he'd been in this cave for many years, and he's been living on a diet of nettles, which if some of you were around last week for Kusala Sara's talk, you'll know sort of that he was living on nettles, and if he wanted more flavour, he would add nettles to the nettles. And because of that, it was said that he was green in colour. So he was quite a frightening figure to behold. But this particular day, he's out, and he's in the vicinity of this young man. And this young man is a warrior, basically. So he comes from this particular, I don't know what you would call it, a race or an ethnic group of Tibetan people who are called the Kambas. So they come from this region of Tibet called Kham. And Kambas are a very, very particular kind of group of people. So I just want to say a little bit about them, because I think it's really worth thinking about who this young man was, what he would have looked like, the sort of person that he was. And just as soon as I put on my Geordie accent just then, you can think about what different people from different parts of the UK are like, and that conjures up images of people from the north of England. Probably when we think of Tibet and we think of Tibetans, we probably don't have much conception of how different people in Tibet are different from each other. But the Kambas are a very, very particular group of people. So for one thing, they're very tall. And they stand out from other Tibetans by the fact that they tend to be extremely tall, almost giants. I don't know if anybody here is familiar with or has come across the Lama Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche, Are people familiar with him? Some people will know who he is. But he's a Khamba, and he's huge. So you see him with other Tibetans, and he sort of stands like, 2 feet taller than them. And Bhante Sangharakshita, who wrote the book that we're taking our inspiration from, The Yogi's Joy, he writes a very lovely description of the Khambas, and I think I'd like to start with that. So he says, Khamba men are very distinctive, even among other Tibetans. There's something decidedly swashbuckling about them. With their big boots and cowboy hats, their swords tucked into their belts, and their jacket sleeves nonchalantly knotted around their waists. Looking at Khamba mule drivers swaggering down the street in Kalimpong, which is where Sangharakshita lived in the 60s, you would think that they owned the place, and people thought it best to get out of their way. I remember on one occasion going into a bank, a place of sober composure, even in India, and finding one of these Tibetans stretched out asleep on the floor. No one had dared to ask him to get up or move along. That would have been asking for trouble. So it's interesting, isn't it? It gives you kind of a picture of what this young man might look like. It put me in mind a little bit with the work that I do. Is I work for an organisation called Karuna, and we're a Triratna Buddhist charity, and we fundraise in the UK, and we give money to projects in India. And one of the projects that we give money to is a school for children of Tibetan refugees in Kalimpong, which is where Sangharakshita used to live. And the man that was running that school for many, many years is a man called Jampal. And he was a very, very devoted student of a Lama called Dada Rinpoche, who was the teacher of the man who founded our movement. And I remember having a conversation with Jampal about these people, the Khambas, and Jampal gets very, very animated. And I remember him saying to me, him describing the Khambas and saying, Khamba, huge one, great big one, like that. And so he was getting very, very animated about him. And the arts teacher in this school, Mr. Doga, he's a Khamba, and he's very, very sort of distinctive looking. So you get an idea of what this young man's like. He's sort of, Bhante uses this word swashbuckling, doesn't he? He almost looks a bit like a pirate. But he would also have been dressed in sort of Tibetan finery. So he would have been dressed in kind of embroidered clothes, very colourful clothes, very beautiful, carrying his swords. And this young man is out one day, and he comes across Milarepa, and something happens, and Milarepa basically demonstrates a miracle to the young man. So what he does is he walks on water. So imagine this young man's out. Apparently he's just on his way to a party. And when you're on your way to a party, you don't expect to see a lama walking on water. Well, I don't anyway. Not that I go to many parties these days. But so this is what happens. And subsequently, as the story develops, we understand more and more about what might actually have been happening there. And I'll say a bit more about that. But for the meantime, you've got this scene where this young man, this young warrior, witnesses Milarepa walking on water. And one of the things about Khambas is that they're extremely devoted. So they're extremely religious people. So they're sort of pirate types and they're warrior types, but they're also very devout. They're very, very serious about their Buddhist practice. And when I was reading this text, and when I've read the song that Milarepa sings about this incident, the word that it brought to mind for me is that I think what Milarepa was trying to do was he was trying to sort of fascinate this young man, basically. That's what it made me think of. For some reason, that word came to my mind. So I thought I would kind of look up the word fascinate. And in the dictionary it says that to fascinate is to engross, to captivate, to absorb, to interest, to enchant, to beguile, to bewitch, enthrall, so that he's spellbound, to transfix, to rivet, to mesmerize. So I think all of those images are quite lovely, aren't they? And this is what happens to this young man. He becomes mesmerized, basically. He's thinking, who is this person who is this slightly fearsome-looking character, because he's been up in the mountains, just living in a cave by himself for years at this point. And he wonders who it is. He's fascinated by this. So Milarepa announces himself to the young man, and he announces himself with a song. And one of the things that he says in the song is, he talks about his accomplishments. So he talks about who he is, but he doesn't talk about his family or his history or any of that sort of thing. But he talks about who he is in terms of his Dharma accomplishment, basically. So in terms of what he's attained, in terms of his mind, in terms of his being. And he also talks as well about his guru. So Milarepa's guru was a man called Marpa, and Milarepa studied under him for many, many years. And Marpa was a deeply compassionate man, but also an extremely hard taskmaster. So some of you will have heard Jnanavacha talking about this a couple of weeks if you were here for Jnanavacha's talks. Knowing that Milarepa had so many unskillful deeds that he had to undo, and knowing that he had to purify so much bad karma, Marpa would set Milarepa to work on things like building towers and building houses, and then he would immediately ask him to tear them down. And he gave him basically a really, really, really hard time for years in order to break him down. I remember reading the story of Milarepa's life and just hearing about these things that he was doing, but he was completely devoted to Marpa. His only solace at that time would be that Marpa's wife, who in the book is called Mrs. Marpa, which I don't know why, I found that faintly comical, but Mrs. Marpa was quite sort of kind to Milarepa, but Marpa was completely uncompromising with him. But he sings about Marpa, and he says about him, "Just to hear his name caused my skin to tingle and my hair to rise," which I think is lovely. Just to hear his name caused my skin to tingle and my hair to rise. And he says that his faith was deepened just by glancing at his face. So we have a sense already of what kind of being Milarepa is. He's extremely devout, and he sees himself very much in relation to his teacher. And I think that's significant because this meeting with the young man, well, in time, the young man will become Milarepa's student. So I think it's very interesting that we're sort of seeing a sense of lineage from Milarepa's teachers through to meeting this young man who will eventually become Milarepa's students. So we also realise, I think, that when Milarepa's talking about who he is and his attainments, that by walking on water, he's not trying to sort of demonstrate anything. He's not trying to kind of show off, as it were. He's basically trying to capture the imagination of this young man so that he can sort of lure him into a spiritual life, kind of lure him into the Buddhist life. So that's what he does. He fascinates him. And he addresses the young man. So Milarepa addresses the young man and he says, "Have you heard what I have sung, my happy boy who seeks naught but pleasure?" So it's like he's got the measure of this young man already. He says, "Have you heard what I have sung, my happy boy who seeks naught but pleasure?" It's like he can see that he's just a young man who's out for a good time, basically. That's what he says to him. And something happens the first time that Milarepa speaks to him. So it's like this young man has a realization, and it's so powerful that he breaks down in tears, basically. So it's like he's pulled the rug under his feet from his feet. He's just been walking along. He's on his way to a party. He sees this incredible being, and then he sees him walk on water. He's interested to know who he is, where he comes from, all of that sorts of things. And then Milarepa addresses him. And this is like some sort of moment of insight. It's like a moment of vision, basically. And it's so strong that he breaks down in tears and he starts to cry. So that's quite strong, isn't it? I don't know, I was just thinking about this myself when I was putting together this talk, and I was thinking moments I've had in my life where it's almost like I haven't been looking for something and something's come along, and then there's an experience that is there that you can't sort of argue with, or it's almost like there's something in your nature that's being pulled to the surface. So maybe I'll just pause there for a moment and see if that's all clear, or if people have questions. Or
what did he say again?
He said, "Have you heard what I have sung? My happy boy who seeks naught but pleasure." So he's already sung this song about who he is, and his guru and his attainment and all of that sort of thing. So he's basically announcing himself to the young man. But by saying this, my happy boy who seeks naught but pleasure, he seems to cut through something in the young man. Yeah. Okay, so maybe I'll move on. Yeah. So the young man responds to Milarepa, and he says, "You are the sage unrecognized, a man of the beyond. You are the Buddha whom one meets so rarely." So he's had this significant experience. Something's cut through his ordinary way of thinking, and he knows that he's met somebody who is extremely significant for him. Maybe he already has the sense of the fact that he's met somebody who will change his life. And he calls him, he says, "You are the sage unrecognized, a man of the beyond." So you could look at that a couple of different ways, I think. I mean, it's almost like he's saying the sage unrecognized in the sense of being unrecognized by him, or it could be the sage unrecognized in the sense that Milarepa's not seeking glory for himself. He's a hermit, basically. He's been up in the mountains for years, just diligently following his practice, basically. But he's had this moment of vision, and he's been moved, basically. Something has stirred in him. And like I said, maybe already he knows that his life's not going to be the same again. So Sangharakshita, he talks about, I find this concept extremely useful. I've been talking about it quite a bit recently. So Sangharakshita talks about the Buddhist path in terms of vision and transformation. Vision and transformation. And I find that really, really helpful. And I think in this story here, what happens is at the beginning, this young man has a moment of vision. So he's come across Milarepa, and it's like something's cut through his ordinary way of thinking, and he's had a vision. But it hasn't completely changed him in and of itself. So he's still stuck with his sort of ordinary mind and his ordinary mode of consciousness, basically. So something needs to be worked out. So he needs to change, basically, in some way. That's the transformation that's required. In order to engage with the path, he'll need to change. But he doesn't know that yet. So what he does is he just does what comes naturally to him. So he feels this tremendous sense of gratitude for meeting Milarepa, and he makes him an offering. So what he does is he offers him his horse. So I think he talks about this in the text. So he describes the horse. So he offers Milarepa his horse, and he says, "Look, will you take my horse?" He says, "On his neck hangs a wondrous bell. On his back of well-known pedigree is a saddlecloth, most warm and smooth. On it rests a strong wooden saddle. The girth is fashioned of steel. His forelock curls like a tiger's smile, shining brightly like a mirrored star." So he describes his horse in these really sort of poetic terms. And I think it's hard for us to appreciate actually what that means. but it's something very, very significant for the young man. I mean, particularly in this part of the world at that time, a horse would be much more than a horse. It would be a status symbol. It would be much more than just a mode of transport. I mean, it would be a mode of transport, which would be helpful and it would be valuable, but it would also be a status symbol, and it would be something that the young man would hold very, very dear. And he offers it to Milarepa. But Milarepa says no. He doesn't want his horse. And the way he replies to him, I think, is very, very significant, and it sets a pattern, and it sets a sort of a precedent for what will happen a few times over the course of the story. So Milarepa says to him, I don't want your horse. He says, a horse of prana mind have I. I adorn him with the silk scarf of dhyana. His skin is the magic ensuing dhyana stage. His headstall is the prana of vital force. His furlock curl is the three-pointed time. So it's almost like he's taking what the young man is offering him, and he's giving him an answer which is saying why he doesn't need it, basically. It's like, why would I need your horse? I have everything I need, and I have this deep Dharma practice. You know, I've been completely transformed by the Dharma. So he says, a horse of prana mind have I. For some reason, this made me think of sort of, it's a bit like, you know, when people are playing poker, and it's a bit like, well, I'll see your such and such, and I'll raise your such and such. It's a bit like saying, yeah, I'll take your horse, and then I'll say, actually, no, I don't need that, because I have this gleaming horse of prana mind. So the young man's very, very sincere, but he's not going to be able to offer Milarepa anything that he wants, and Milarepa continually just rebuffs him, basically. So he offers him his horse, and he says no, he doesn't want that, and he explains why, because he has everything that he needs, basically. He has this deep Dharma practice, and that's all he needs to sustain him. The young man offers to build him temples. He doesn't want that, and then eventually the young man offers him his sister's hand in marriage. So he's actually saying, like, come and join my family. You know, I think you're so wonderful. Come and join my family. You can marry my sister. So what do you think Milarepa says to that?
Okay.
I really hoped somebody would say that, Brian, so thanks. Yeah, so he says that, and that's the end of the story. Of course he says no. But it's significant, isn't it? Because I think it's almost like at every stage he's offering something a little bit more. So he's offering his horse, then he's offering to build him things. The young man is wealthy, he can do that. And then he offers his sister's hand in marriage. Now this is a bit strange. He goes from offering his sister's hand in marriage to then offering his boots, which is a slightly odd order of events, isn't it? One would think, you know, you don't want to marry my sister? Well, how about these boots? But he offers him his boots, and the same thing happens, basically. But Milarepa rebuffs him beautifully again. So Milarepa says to him, I cut my boots from the hide of the renunciation of samsara, as with the leather of awakening from transiency and delusion. I made my boots with the craftsmanship of deep faith in karma, with the dye of non-clinging to the myriad forms, and with the thread and rope of devotion. That's fantastic, isn't it? I cut my boots from the hide of the renunciation of samsara, as with the leather of awakening from transiency and delusion. So again, he's saying, look, there's nothing you can offer me. Milarepa, apparently he's completely naked. I mean, it's worth saying that. So the young man's probably slightly concerned for him, because he doesn't have any clothes, he doesn't have any shoes, it's up in the Himalayas, it's freezing. But he's offering his boots, which is, well, you could look at it symbolically, but you could also it's just a sort of practical thing that he's offering him. But Milarepa's saying, look, I don't need any of these things. He doesn't even need anything to cover him. He's completely naked. And the reason why he doesn't need that is because of the depth of his practice. And then ultimately he offers him his trousers. What more can a man offer another man than his trousers? And it's interesting, Bhante says in here that only conveys the depth of his ignorance, which I think is interesting. And it says more about the young man himself, because the young man is embarrassed that Milarepa's naked. This put me in mind of a time when, many years ago, I was in India, and a bit like this young man, I was up a mountain in the Himalayas, and I came across... wasn't kind of a cave, but it was sort of like in a sort of a grotto on the side of this hill. I came across this man, and he was a really crazy looking man. He was very small, about 4 foot tall, and naked, like Milarepa was, and really, really, really long dreadlocks, basically. And he was living in this kind of shrine temple sort of thing. And I got talking to him, like you do, and I said to him, I think I asked him to give me a teaching. So we got talking, and he said, "Where have you come from?" Blah, blah, blah. And I said, "Oh, could you give me a teaching?" And he leant over and he just looked at me, stared me in the eyes, and he went, "Enjoy your life." Okay, fair enough. That's pretty good. So I thought that's a pretty decent teaching. So what can I do in return? So this man was completely naked. So I offered him my socks and a banana. This is true, by the way. So I offered him my socks and a banana, and the socks he wasn't really interested in. He just sort of went like that. And the banana he took off me, and I thought, well, that's good, because he was very thin, this man. And I thought, you could probably do with some food. And he took the banana, and he basically just kind of like threw it at the shrine that he was in. Basically, I think it was Hanuman, that was a Hindu monkey god, and he just threw the banana at Hanuman as if to say, like, I don't want your banana. I'm gonna offer it up to the gods. So anyway, that's a small aside about my own experience of making offerings, but. So he offers him his trousers, and he doesn't want his trousers, and he refuses again by song, basically. And each time the young man offers something, it's almost like Milarepa is just showing more the depth of his practice. I mean, he uses this beautiful poetic language, but he's also just revealing the fact that he needs nothing, basically. There's nothing that the young man can offer him that he needs, and he shows who he is in this rejection, because Milarepa would show himself to be a completely different being, a different person, if he accepted the young man's gifts, basically. So it's like this is who he's revealing himself to be, and at each stage, that realization goes deeper and deeper in the young man. So his wealth is the Dharma, basically. That's what Milarepa is showing. And at one point he says to the young man that his wealth is the Dharma, and his wealth comes from the whispered lineage, which is the Kagyu tradition that Milarepa belongs to. And that's the reason why it's called the whispered lineage is that it's transmitted one-to-one by each teacher. There are no written teachings, basically. So the young man changes his tack slightly, and he can see that in order to please Milarepa, he's going to have to offer him something slightly different. So offering him material goods is not going to work, basically. So he says, it's natural for a supreme being like you not to want these illusory possessions. I now offer you my 3 companions. From now on, I will never carry a weapon or kill sentient beings. I beg you to grant me the ordination. I pray you to protect me with your compassionate grace. So the young man's come so far that he's now prepared to, well, firstly lay down his weapons, and also to start offering himself to Milarepa, basically. So he's asking for ordination. He's asking Milarepa to take him as his student. And I think this is very, very significant, because what it shows is that the young man is starting to realise that actually he's going to have to change his life. He's going to have to do something different in laying down his weapons. So that's what he's been doing all his life, is living his life a certain kind of way. And he's been engaging in violence and fighting. And he sees that he's going to have to do something. He sees that he's going to have to do something different. And I think in asking for ordination, in asking Milarepa to become his guru and his teacher, he's also somehow, well, it's a paradox, I think. He is entrusting himself to Milarepa. So what am I trying to say? It's like he's come to a point where his old life, he knows that his old life isn't going to work for him anymore, and he's going to have to do something slightly differently. So he's going to have to place his trust in Milarepa, because he's seen that he has something that he doesn't have himself. And I was thinking about this in relation to my own experience, and sort of trying to unpick this and unravel this a little bit. And obviously, this is a myth. It's a mythic story. There's fantastical elements to it, but I think it also has something to say to us about us and our own practice and our own existence as well. And I think for me, what it spoke to me of was, at some point when I was convinced enough about the Buddhist path, actually recognizing that I can put my trust in people that are wiser than I am. That it's not just about me becoming a sort of a wiser... Maybe we want to give that man a nudge, I don't know. Maybe we could do some exercises. It's not just about me becoming a kind of a wiser person or a more knowledgeable practitioner or something like that. That in order to progress on the path, we have to be comfortable. We're not even comfortable, actually. Comfortable is not a good word to describe it, but we have to be willing to place our trust in people that are wiser than we are. And in our movement, specifically, that happens very, very significantly at ordination. So like this young man, at a certain point I asked to be ordained. So I asked to join the Triratna Buddhist order. And then I asked somebody to be my preceptor. So I asked somebody to be the person who would ordain me. So that person for me was Jnanavacha, who gave the talk a couple of weeks ago. And a very, very significant part of the path for me was that I trust Jnanavacha a huge amount. I have a tremendous amount of love and respect for him. And in putting my faith and trust in him, and him ordaining me, that somehow enables something to come to the surface in me that wouldn't if I wasn't willing to put my trust in other people. Does that make sense? Yeah. I'm just wondering how I was explaining that. Okay, so maybe we'll pause there again for a moment and see if there's any questions on that before we proceed.
He calls him a boy. Do you think there's a significant age difference between them?
Yeah, that's an interesting point, actually, Melvin. I had thought about that. Because I think by this stage, I don't know how old Milarepa is, but I would imagine he'd certainly be advanced in years compared to the young man. So we could sort of take that as mythically significant. But I think the most important thing is that he's experienced in terms of his practice, and his dedication to the path and the things that he's realised. But yeah, what was it that made you ask that, or why you?
Well, could it be? I don't know. No, just there's often a power relationship between old and young, and whether that was the case here. But believe it or not, I just had this flash of another spiritual leader who was quite young. Apparently. Jesus, I mean, I'm not promoting the guy, but he was a young man.
Should we put a little disclaimer there?
Get it on record.
Yeah. Little subtitle across the bottom. We in no way promote or condemn. Yeah.
But that came to mind as well.
Yeah.
He was a young man.
Yeah.
So his age is not.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, isn't it, as well, on the path. Sometimes we can we come across people that are older than us and are more experienced and more wise. And then I've had the experience of meeting younger people that are significantly more experienced in their practice than I am. So it's interesting, isn't it? Sometimes there's two things at play. There's a sort of older, there's being older in years, and then there's being deeper in our practice as well. I don't know how old he is, but I think he's quite a bit older at this point. Yeah. Is there anybody else? Okay, so maybe we'll move on. So I think it's significant that this young man has realised that the gifts that he's offering Milarepa won't work, basically. And so he tries different things, and he's offered to lay down his weapons. And then at this point, what he does is he invites Milarepa to come to his home. He invites him to his sort of hometown, basically, and invites him to come back with him. But again, what happens is he actually exposes himself in this, because he invites him and he uses that as an excuse he sort of sings this song, which is a diatribe about how all these other regions of Tibet are really sort of horrible or really hostile or really difficult, because he's asked Milarepa, what he's doing with his life, basically. And Milarepa says, well, I'm going to go to this place and I spend some time here and I spend some time there. And this young man sort of has this diatribe about different parts of Tibet. So he betrays in his negative speech his undeveloped mind, basically. And Milarepa sees through this and points this out to him. And it's interesting, in the book, it's quite funny that Sangharakshita talks about this episode, and he relates it to Bethnal Green, which I thought was quite funny. And he was basically saying that when people were talking about buying this centre in the 70s, apparently everybody said, what on earth are you buying a building in Bethnal Green for? Nobody's ever going to go down there. It's horrible, the people are awful, you won't be accepted, and da-da-da. And he talks about how the local people were actually very, very straightforward and very welcoming, that they were quite sort of rough, down-to-earth people, but they were very, very supportive for us building this centre here. That's interesting. So Milarepa points out to him that his fear of these other places is his experience, it's his own mind. And the sort of interaction between the two of them comes to a pinnacle at a certain point where Milarepa says that he has to leave, basically, that he has to go. And he also suggests to the young man that it's time for him to go. So he says, my dear contented youth, it's time for you to go. May your health be good and your life be long. My dear contented youth, it's time for you to go. May your health be good and your life be long. So what he's saying to this young man is, I think he's trying to provoke him slightly, basically. He's at a juncture, he's at a crossroads, and the young man knows that he can't follow Milarepa and have everything that he's had in his old life. And Milarepa is sort of pointing this out to him. And he says it's time for him to make up his mind, basically. He can't hold on to both ways of being. So he says to him that it's time for you to go. And really that's a sort of provocation to the young man, that he needs to choose. He needs to choose between his old life and a new life. So I'm going to leave it there for this story. I'm going to talk a little bit about the significance of it, I think, but I'm not going to say any more about their meeting because I think that might be picked up in future weeks. But I think one of the things that really stood out for me about this is thinking about the relationship of loss and gain and perspective. So this young man, he comes along, he's rich, he's young, he's good looking, he's a successful warrior, and all he can see is the world through his eyes at that point. But in meeting Milarepa, he sees something different. So he sees possibility, basically. And Milarepa fascinates him with this sort of trick that he does of walking on water. There's clearly something in the young man because he has this awakening experience. So there's something in him which it's almost like he'd been longing for this meeting all along, but he didn't know that. And it's like Milarepa has to embody something for him. He has to demonstrate something for him. And what he demonstrates is the possibility of change. So the young man looks at Milarepa and he sees this incredible being, and it's something different that he could never ever have imagined on his own. Because he was too mired in his own life. He was too sort of stuck in his limited thought process. And this made me think of me when I was a small boy. Because what it sort of shows us basically is that, well, as I was saying earlier, I think sometimes other people have to embody the possibility of change for us. We have to see that in other people. We can't always see what's possible for us. By definition, by the fact that it's the very nature of the fact that our mind is limited, our consciousness is limited. And it made me think about when I was a very small boy, so this is like 40 years ago, I remember me and my sister sort of playing this little game where she said, right, I'm going to grant you 2 wishes and you can have anything you want. What would it be? So I'm going to give you 2 wishes and I'm going to make them come true. So what 2 things do you want? So what do you think I wanted? Say again? I wasn't that smart, unfortunately. No. Anybody else hazard a guess?
How old were you?
4.
Chocolate.
Close, yeah. So what I wanted was a sausage that when you ate it, it would reappear. and a special machine that would give me as much Coca-Cola as I wanted. So that's ridiculous, isn't it? When you think about that, you think, okay, obviously now it's 40 years later, and I can have as much vegetarian sausages as I want, but I don't spend that much money on sausages. But what I'm trying to show there is it's an extreme example because I was a child. But we can't imagine what the possibility is for us. We can't quite see it with our limited imagination. And even in terms of our own practice. So when I started practicing, I came to the Buddhist path like 20 years ago. I had no idea of what would happen to me over the next 20 years. And really, in some ways, I've got no idea what's going to happen to me over the next 20 years or 40 years, hopefully, if I don't know how long I'll live. But one way that we can move towards that is that we can see people that are much further down the path than we are, and we can be inspired by them. And actually something magical happens in our association with those people as well. It's not just a case of like we're sort of a bit influenced or something like that. Sangharakshita has this wonderful phrase where he talks about spiritual friendship, and he says the Dharma is caught, not taught. And I think that's lovely. The Dharma is caught, not taught. It's by being around people that inspire us that we somehow catch something of that. And it's almost like the flame gets ignited, and that's how we start to change as well. And this is what's happened with this young man. So he's been inspired by Milarepa, and he can't see what's possible for him, but he starts to see it in the incredible sort of being of Milarepa. Okay. And I think we could see this tale as we could see it as a story, so we could see it as an encounter between two people. But the way I look at it is, well, it struck me as a kind of an allegory, basically. It's almost like a myth or a metaphor for the spiritual life. That we start off just approaching it in the way that we have been living our life up until that point, and we think that we need to approach it in the same way. This is what the young man does. You know, he starts offering things that are meaningless to Milarepa, but that's all he knows how to do. So we approach it in the way, in our limited way, which is fine. That's just naturally what we're going to do. But at each stage, as he realizes more and more what he needs to do, we make a deeper kind of commitment, basically. And that's, for me, what this story is about. It's about commitment. So it's almost like you could see it as a lifetime sort of played out in a drama which takes place over a period of a short time, over one meeting. What this young man really needs to offer, what he really needs to offer to Milarepa, is himself. That's what he needs to offer. Milarepa's not interested in material goods, and he's not interested in joining his family. He's not interested in his horse. What he's interested in is the young man actually offering himself. And he has a sense of when that starts to happen. He's such a realized being that he knows when he's making a genuine commitment. So he needs to be prepared to offer more than material wealth. He needs to let go of his preconceptions, and he needs to offer himself. So I think what this says to me is, if we could see ourselves as a sort of a parallel of this young man, it's what he needs to do, but also what we need to do, is to begin to let go of who we think we are, to let go of our limited view of ourselves, and to open up to the possibility that there is more, and that more is way beyond what we can see at the moment. It's way beyond our limited imagination. And we can see that embodied in other people, and for the young man, it's embodied in the yogi Milarepa. Okay, so I'll leave it there.